Good afternoon. Welcome to the fourth session of More Time for Books. These Zoom sessions were meant to be part of our new way of being, to keep on learning, socializing within our networks and possibly form new networks. I'm Vivian Lieber, a Vice President of Women's League and the Chair of Women's League Reads and Books programs. Women's League Reads is a member benefit program among our rich educational offerings. Our next author interview is with Goldie Goldblum, whose own life story is fascinating and whose novel, On Division, tells of a woman testing her boundaries and her individuality during a personal crisis. Please to join us, our Women's League Reads groups, get all the messages, send an email to Lois Silverman she is our Internet Services Chair, lsilverman@wlcj.org with your sisterhood's name and location and your Women's League membership number. So that's my little advertisement. So here today we have with us our Women's League Executive Director, Rabbi Ellen Wallens-Fields. A little later, President Margie Miller will join us. And I see many other familiar faces. I'll be introducing others shortly. So later on, we'll have time we have several presenters today, and later on, we will have time for the audience participation as well. For the last three sessions, first we discussed books that were adapted as films. Then we discussed biography and memoir. Last session, we discussed humor and satire. Today, we celebrate Israel and visit Israel through books, fiction and nonfiction, because today, here it's still Yom HaZikaron. In Israel, it has ended because it's nighttime now. That's the day of remembrance for the IDF soldiers and civilians who lost their lives in all of Israel's wars. And we are leading in tonight and tomorrow with a joyful day of celebration, Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel's Independence Day, 29th year. Is that correct? No.
72nd.
Year. Pardon?
72nd.
Okay, 72nd, sorry, another. So we are with Israel in spirit all the time. I also want to welcome, I think we might have with us some of our Israeli members, Mizorti women, and that's wonderful. If you want to identify yourself, possibly in that chat box that you'll find along the bottom of your screen if you're on Zoom, and say hello in the chat box. That would be wonderful, and we'll talk further later. So we're going to have several presenters. Starting off will be Rachel Kamen, who's director of the Joseph and May Gray Cultural and Learning Center at North Suburban Synagogue, Bethel in Highland Park, Illinois. And from Israel, we'll welcome Margie Cohn-Jackal, who is an educator in Rehovot. We also have Susan Farber from Cincinnati, Ohio, with some books to present. Sandra Carlton, who is joining us as well from outside of Chicago. And we may have a few others, and I hope that the audience members will later jump in with some of their own book recommendations and experiences. As I said, there's a chat box for if you want to indicate you want to speak, you can do it that way. So we'll end the session in about an hour. And afterwards, please send me an email, personally to vlieber@wlcj.org to request the list of books that we covered during the session, and that will be emailed to you. So with that, I'd like to introduce again, Rachel Kamen.
Great, thank you so much, Vivian. I'm gonna share my screen so that you can see the books that I'm talking about. So just bear with me. So today I'm going to talk about some recent novels that take place in Israel or that feature Israeli characters. And I'm limiting myself. I'm only talking about novels that were written in English. I also read a lot of Israeli novels translated from Hebrew, but we'll save that category for another time. So Fleischmann Is in Trouble made quite a splash when it was published last year, landing on the New York Times bestseller list and being longlisted for the National Book Award. It also made it onto almost every best books of the year list, from the Chicago Tribune, the Washington Post, NPR, to Vanity, Vogue, GQ, Entertainment Weekly, and more. Not to mention, it was a National Jewish Book Award debut fiction finalist. The story centers around Dr. Toby Fleischmann, who divorces his rather hostile wife, Rachel, when he thinks he can find genuine happiness elsewhere. But then, after sneaking into his house, his apartment in the middle of the night, and leaving him with their 2 sleeping children without telling him that she was doing this, Rachel abruptly disappears. And this, is obviously causes Toby to go into quite a tailspin and forces him to acknowledge the painful truth about his marriage. So it's hard to say that I loved or even enjoyed listening to this audiobook, but I found that I couldn't turn it off. I just needed to know how things turned out for these interesting, complex, and deeply, deeply flawed characters. And while I didn't always agree with her, Taffy Brodesser-Akner makes some very poignant, insightful, and thought-provoking observations about marriage, money, love, friendship, parenting, success, the role of women, and just life in general for 40-somethings in today's society. And why I'm talking about this book today, why it belongs in this category, one of the things I especially loved is that Toby and his 2 best friends all met during their junior year abroad at Hebrew University in the 1990s. Personally related to that, I attended Hebrew University for my junior year abroad in the 1990s. So there's some very important kind of flashback scenes that take place in Jerusalem. The other thing I really admired about this book was the way that the narrator's identity and her own story were slowly revealed. It was a really clever plot device. So it'll be interesting to see what else comes out from Taffy Brodesser-Akner. I think she's going to have a hard act to follow when a first book is so enthusiastically received, but we'll see what happens. And for a lot of the books, if you'll see on this slide, I also put some read-alikes. Like you'll like, if you like this book, here are some other books you like, or if you like these books, you'll like this one. And I can also send that out to Vivian, and she'll include that to anyone who's interested. So as most of us know, Jewish law requires that the Kaddish prayer be recited 3 times a day for 11 months following a parent's death in order to elevate the deceased soul. This is a problem for Larry, the protagonist in Nathan Englander's 3rd novel, Kaddish.com. Larry is mourning the loss of his beloved father, but he has left his family's Orthodox community in Brooklyn. Larry finds a solution at Kaddish.com, a website where users can pay to match a dead relative with a pious yeshiva student in Jerusalem who will recite the prayer on their behalf. So it's kind of like J-Date for the dead. But then years later, when he has found his way back to Orthodoxy, Larry, who now goes by Shuli, is haunted by what he has done and sets out on a quest to find the yeshiva student in Jerusalem who supposedly said Kaddish for his father. Tova Mervis, the novelist, described the book in the New York Times as brimming with Talmudic references and biblical allusions, Jewish legal principles, and Yiddish-inflected dialogue. Kaddish.com reads like a modern-day Hasidic tale in which religious characters are bedeviled by the challenges of upholding God's world in an all-too-human world. So, and this is typical of many of Englander's stories. His protagonist, in this case, migrates between the religious and the secular worlds. Personally, I had a hard time believing that someone as cynical as Larry, who had once been fully immersed in the modern secular world, could have been so clueless and naive when he returned to Judaism. But regardless, it was a really quick read, much easier to get through than Englander's previous novel, Dinner at the Center of the Earth. And it definitely begs to be discussed. There's a lot in there. So Martin Fletcher, I'm a big fan. Like his previous novels, and which I've read them all and really enjoyed. Promised Land, this one came out 2 years ago, is an accessible, interesting, and well-researched page turner. And this time he sets his story in Israel between 1950 and 1967. The story begins when 14-year-old Peter is sent to America to escape Nazi Germany, while his younger brother Ari and their entire family are sent to the death camp. Only Ari survives. The brothers, though, luckily, are reunited in Israel, where Ari becomes a successful businessman and Peter becomes a top Mossad agent. But then they fall in love with the same woman. And as you can imagine, there's problems, and their jealousies threaten to tear their new lives apart. Martin Fletcher, if you're not familiar with him, spent many, many years as the NBC News bureau chief in Tel Aviv. He's currently splits his time between Israel, New York, and I think Mexico. And he still sometimes is a special correspondent for NBC News. He and his wife raised their 3 sons in Israel. So he brings his own background and experiences into this novel. Sadness is a White Bird by Morial, Rothman, Zecker is a powerful and beautiful and heartbreaking debut novel about an Israeli-born American teenager preparing to serve in the IDF, while also trying to reconcile his close relationship with 2 Palestinian siblings and his deeply ingrained loyalties to his family and country. The author, Morial Rothman Zucker, is an American-Israeli writer, poet, and novelist who was born in Jerusalem, but graduated from Middlebury College with a degree in Arabic and political science. He now lives in Yellow Springs, Ohio, and the novel was written and published in English. It reminded me a lot of All the Rivers by Dorit Rabinyan, which was written in Hebrew, but I personally connected to Jonathan and Nimreen in Sadness is a White Bird more than I did to Liat and Hilmi, the 2 characters in All the Rivers. Also, since the characters in this book are all between the ages of 17 and 19, I would recommend this book to mature teen readers. It almost read like a YA, like a young adult teen book. The other thing I want to point out is that the audiobook narrator was excellent. This is usually not the case with a lot of Jewish and Israeli books. And this book, it was filled with Hebrew and Arabic words and phrases, and the narrator's accent and pronunciations were accurate and authentic, which was just really rare. So I really do recommend this as an audiobook. And it also was a Hadassah Magazine Ribbelow Prize finalist and a National Jewish Book Award debut fiction site. Okay, so another author writing, native Hebrew speaker writing in English. This is The Best Place on Earth by Ayelet Zabari. And of course, writers are known for living outside the lands of their birth. Czech-born Milan Kundera lives in Paris, writes in French. Jumta Lahiri moved to Rome and wrote her first book in Italian a couple years later. And in 2014, Arab-Israeli writer Syed Kashua decamped to Champaign, Illinois, and continues to write in Hebrew. So it comes as no surprise that there's no shortage of Israeli writers like Ayelet Zabari and Morial Rothman Zecker, who have made their homes in various corners of the world. Some have adopted the language of their resident country and choose to write in it. So this is Ayelet Zabari's debut story collection. It won the 2015 Sammy Rohr Prize, which is the biggest prize in Jewish literature. It's a $100,000 prize. It was nominated for the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award and was published internationally to great acclaim. Zabari was born in Israel in 1973 to a large family of Yemeni descent. She grew up in the suburbs of Tel Aviv, served in the Israeli army, and then traveled extensively throughout Southeast Asia, Europe, North America, before settling in Vancouver, Canada in 1998. She wrote the stories in The Best Place on Earth in English. It was first published in Canada, and then it came out in the US. And then in 2016, it was translated into Hebrew. which is interesting because Ayelet Zabari did not translate it herself. She said she couldn't, it would be like rewriting. She said she couldn't be the translator. But it's kind of interesting to wrap your head around the fact that she's a native Hebrew speaker, wrote the stories in English, and then somebody else translated them into Hebrew. And as Ayelet Zabari explains, she said, I definitely think we need a more diverse perspective on Israel in English literature. Most books about Israel tell stories by and about Ashkenazi Jews. My family immigrated to Israel from Yemen, so I chose to write about Mizrahi characters whose stories are rarely told in literature. Jews who descended from the Middle East and North Africa, Jews who spoke Arabic and not Yiddish, ate pita and not gefilte fish. It was also a chance to rectify my childhood experience of not finding my family or myself in any of the books that I read. This collection of short stories was a favorite with my short story discussion groups. I did it with 2 different groups, actually 3 different groups. Yael Polliris has a memoir that came out last year called The Art of Leaving, which has been on my to-read list, but I've heard it was excellent. And also, in addition to winning the Sammy Rohr Prize, she won the 2016 Edward Lewis Wallen Award as well. So if you're a short story, if you like short stories, I do really highly recommend these. I think almost all of the stories are set in Israel, with a few of them set in Canada, but usually Israeli characters living in Canada. Okay, A Woman is No Man. This is the story of 3 generations of Palestinian American women in contemporary Brooklyn. The protagonist, Isra, was born in Palestine, but comes to Brooklyn when her family arranges a marriage to Adam, who runs a deli in Manhattan. Her own mother warns her, there is nothing out there for a woman but her house and home. Marriage, motherhood, that is a woman's only work. The narrative eventually shifts to Dea, the oldest of Isra's 4 daughters, who is left to tell her mother's story. A devastating, heartbreaking, violent, and seemingly never-ending cycle of oppression and abuse that has its roots in the author's own arranged marriage at the age of 19. So why am I including this book today? Because while an intense, difficult, and disturbing read, I believe that it gives us a window into this culture and describes from the perspective of one Palestinian family how they lost their home and became refugees after Israel's independence and the devastating effects of the occupation. Not surprising, the few mentions of Israel, the Israeli government, and the IDF are not positive, to say the least. And with most of the story taking place in America, there really are only a few mentions. This is not a political book in that way. But I found this to be such an eye-opening read. The concept of books as windows and mirrors is often used by educators, especially when it comes to children's literature. But I think it can also be applied to us as adult readers. Books that provide windows offer us a view into a reality different than our own, while books that reflect our own life are mirrors. Even as adults, I feel strongly that it's important to read books that are both windows and mirrors. And this is an example that has gotten a lot of buzz. I think the sticker on the book jacket, it was a Jenna Bush book club selection. This is I think a really important window book that we can read. And again, about a community that I really knew nothing about. And what was shocking to me also was that this was contemporary. You know, this was not, you know, the 1950s or the 1960s or the 1970s. This is a story that takes place today. Okay, and then talking about windows and mirrors leads me to my last review, which is really only a half review because I'm currently reading the book. It's on my nightstand. Actually, I brought it down downstairs today for the presentation. This is called Apiragon. I had to look up how to pronounce that. Apiragon by Colum McCann. What is an Apiragon? One of my friends was saying, you know, that's a terrible title for a book because nobody knows what it is and how to pronounce it. But page 82, he tells us what an Apiragon is. An Apiragon is a shape with a countably infinite number of sides. A shape with a countably infinite number of sides. The novel takes its inspiration from the real-life friendship of a Palestinian, Bassam Aramin, and an Israeli, Rami Elchanan. The men are united in their grief. Rami's 13-year-old daughter was killed by a suicide bomber on Ben Yehuda Street in Jerusalem, and Bassam's 10-year-old daughter was killed by a stray rubber bullet fired by an IDF soldier. Both men join the Parent Circle, a support group for bereaved parents from both sides who unite to press for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. The book is structured into 1,001 chapters. 1,001 chapters. Some are as short as one word or one sentence. Some include a photograph or a drawing. So this is definitely not a typical novel. I'm at page 124. It's a, what is it? It's a 450 plus page book. I'm at page 124 and I'm on chapter 278. So if that tells you something. So I'm still getting my feet wet in this book, but the reviews have been glowing. So for example, it's a masterpiece, a novel that will change the world. And you don't hear that very often. That was from The Guardian. The New York Times said, it does far more than make an argument for peace. It is itself an agent of change. And Kirkus Reviews said, a soaring, ambitious triumph, deeply nuanced and sensitive, a remarkable achievement. McCann's latest novel might be his finest. And actually, maybe some of you are familiar. I was not familiar with his previous works, so I can't compare it to his previous works. I'll have to report back on whether I feel that the book lives up to all of this hype. But you can follow me on Facebook or on Goodreads for my complete review of A Paragon once I finish it, as well as all of my book reviews. I post all of what I'm reading on Goodreads and then I repost onto Facebook. So I'd love to connect with any and all of you, and also look forward to hearing from our other presenters and hear what you are all reading.
Thank you, Rachel. You introduced us to some books I don't think many of us would have discovered on our own, some of them. Others are better known. Thank you so much. And we all should, all our lives, journey into other people's lives and to make new discoveries. I'd like to turn next to Susan Farber. And after that, if Margie Cohn is on the phone, is on the call, you'll go next. So Susan.
And Susan, it's Rabbi, do you want to control the screen? I think I have you as a co-host, so I believe you should be able to.
Okay, it's all right. You could show the 4 to 5 slides that I have there via the PDF I sent you. I'd rather you guide that and focus on that while I focus on talking. Good afternoon, ladies. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Anyway, I put together a few books. They're a little bit on the older side, and it's very interesting that Rachel picked a book about Yemenite heritage of Zabaris. I've read about her. So I think this is, I don't know if this is the one. I think it says Israeli.
Is it on there now? Israel Through Literature?
Not yet.
Oh, should have been. Okay. Now?
Now it is, yes.
Okay, good.
Okay, so this is some weaving. I just thought I'd try to get the weaving together of ideas here in order. If we could turn to go further down in the PDF. Our first book is Yael Polliris. She grew up in Michigan, perhaps in Lansing, Michigan, because she created this book, The Protagonist Family and the Lonely Tree, which was published in 2010, as you can see, and this is the original book cover. So Yael creates a trajectory of a family's life. The female protagonist is one of the daughters of this family that has left Poland for Palestine in the 30s to escape the Nazis. And the trajectory ends in the 50s, 60s. And so our protagonist grows up, gets educated in Israel, and her dream is to go to the United States because she is really exhausted emotionally and physically from the toil she and her family go through in building one of the first historic FARs or settlements and dealing with the Palestinian. And then you have some very rich description of the war in 48, the War of Liberation of the state of Israel being liberated from the British control and so forth. So it's a very inspiring book, rich description of the trajectory of this family and this protagonist, female protagonist life. And there's a love intrigue involved here as well. So that kind of branches between, shows the connection and the resistance and the suspicions at first of the Ashkenazi Jews who come from Europe with the Sephardi Yemenite community that has been also coming to live in Palestine / Israel in its new days. So I was intrigued by it because of its historicity. It's fiction, but it has a historical covering of what we know of Israel's history. So if we can go to the next book title that I've selected here. This is another interesting book. Zahava Englert is an American. She has also made Aliyah like Yael Polliris. And she wrote a book called The Devorah Waisman. It's much more contemporary. At times, the plot seems a little bit contrived, in my opinion, but the love intrigue and the events of the story are palpable for readers who like fiction. We start in New York City. Our protagonist is an American Jew growing up in New York, an only child of intellectuals, and she ends up having a summer in Israel at the very beginning, and she ends up falling in love with a young man who is from the kibbutz community. And so in a way, it also deals with the whole issue in the 80s and 90s and aughts of Jewish life in Israel, the political background, the historical events, and topics like that are brought in to frame the book and give it a life and some substance. Next book title. And before we go on, just stop for a minute, Rabbi. There is on that slide, there is a link. So if you get a copy of this PDF from the rabbi, or I'll send it to Vivian so that she can put it on the Google Reads network. There is an interview with the author that I found online from israelforever.org. So I thought that would be interesting for people. The next book by Devorah Waisman, even though I pulled out the title in Hebrew, was first written in English. Devorah Waisman is an Australian who made Aliyah and wrote this pomegranate pendant. And this very much connects back with Ayelet Zabari, who's of Yemenite heritage, because this book starts in the 1880s. And it starts in Sana'a, Yemen. And it describes the traveling of these family members on foot and by boat and by camel to get from Sana'a, Yemen to Jerusalem, and how they recreate their lives in Jerusalem in the late 1800s. And there's jewelry, Yemenite jewelry on the cover of this book because the father makes jewelry, he's a jewelry maker. And so there again, we have the history from the perspective of the Yemenite community of what they went through. And again, it's the trajectory all the way into the 1950s. Many, many decades of the experience of this family and love. There's also love interest in here, very rich historical setting. And as I mentioned here, there is a movie that's been made based on this novel that was first shown in Jerusalem at the Jerusalem Film Festival. So I don't know, I didn't get to read up about the history of the film and how it was received and how well it was connected to the book. So our next book is a nonfiction book that I came across, and it's about a woman who grew up in Philadelphia, a prosperous Jew in Philadelphia in the early 1900s. And she became a writer, a journalist in, I'm sorry for the gap, Atlantic City, New Jersey. And Rabbi Stephen Wise of New York facilitated her getting a visa to travel to Israel. In 1933, she settled in Israel and became a journalist there. And these are her diary writings that have been edited by these two women for an academic press out of Massachusetts. I took this photo. I'm sorry, it's not coming up that clearly, but you could see this has her passport in it. But what's interesting about her is she ended up dying in Israel as a young mother. Her son, she had one son, he was probably about the age of 10 when she succumbed to an illness that was very sudden and devastating for her. So the woman of the novel, of the book, is Dorothy Ruth Khan Ben Adon. She married an Israeli, Ben-Adon. Very interesting life. And when I read this a few years ago, the other year, I thought her description of what's going on in Palestine was very rich and vivid. So again, if you want a historical perspective of what the land has been like, what the relationships were under the British Mandate, you get a very good sense of that from these diary entries that this woman maintained. So our next book is going in a very different direction. It's a cookbook called The Taste of Israel, a Mediterranean Feast. I happen to have a copy of this, and as I wrote on this slide that it's no longer in print, but I discovered on Abe Books that it can be purchased as a used copy. But I wanted to show you, this is my copy of the book. Hopefully people can see this reasonably well, but the photos in this book are just amazing. And they kind of give you an idea of how, this is a photo to explain how zug, Yemenite zug, is prepared. Here is a photo of a man showing you all different kinds of Israeli cheeses. So it's a very beautifully illustrated book. Here is another picture of the zug as it has been made in the dish, as well as the Yemenite bread. So yes, or really Yemenite pancakes. And so they give you, my husband's been looking through this book to find a recipe for our dinner tomorrow since it's Yom HaAtzmaut. So he's making some stuffed eggplant that's stuffed with mushrooms and olives. So we're going to celebrate in style A Taste of Israel. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Although these books are fabulous.
Thank you.
We're really getting Israel from every angle. Thank you, Susan.
You're
I'd
welcome.
like to call on Margie Cohn Jackal.
And did
to
she send
present a
you
book.
also?
Pardon?
Did she send you a presentation?
Yes, it was the yellow cover, the 7 Good Years.
Okay,
And
gotcha.
there, yeah. Are you there with us, Margie, and unmuted? Yeah, that was it.
That was it, I know. I just am
Briefly.
looking for her. This is Margie, just says Margie with a vest? Okay, there you are, right?
I was saying that I couldn't unmute myself. You had to unmute me.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I needed to find which Margie. You're
I
all
can-
there. Do you
I
want
just
the
I'd
screen
like to
on?
remind everyone that Margie is coming to us from Israel, from Rehovot, Israel, and we mazel tov on Yom.
Ha'atzmaut. Thanks.
Right now it's late evening in Israel, so
Yeah.
fun.
I would like to talk about this book called The 7 Good Years, and I'll briefly outline what I would like to get to before I start. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Edgar Carrick, who is the author, and I'm going to explain where the name of the book comes from. And why. In other words, okay, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about his growing up as the 3rd child of Holocaust survivors and why he feels impelled to be a storyteller. And then I'm going to talk about what makes this specifically an Israeli book. And then I'm going to end up with some details about his writing style, why he writes the way he does. But first of all, Edgar Carrick was born in Ramat Gan, which is a suburb of Tel Aviv, in 1967. 3rd child of parents who survived the Holocaust. His parents are both from Poland, even though they met in Israel. And there's an entertaining story about that in the book, how they met and how the mother was amazed that he actually asked for her phone number. Edgar Carrick went to famous high school in Ramat Gan. He lives in Tel Aviv with his wife, Shira Geffen, who is the daughter of Yonatan Geffen, who is an Israeli satirist who's very, very cutting, very good. He lectures at Tel Aviv University and he holds dual Israeli and Polish citizenship. What is the name of the book and why is it called what it is called? We probably are all familiar with the Joseph story in the Bible about Pharaoh's dream. The 7 good years refer to Pharaoh's dream of the 7 fat-fleshed cows, and the 7 bad years are the years of the lean and ugly cows, and it's a prophecy of what's to come in Egypt. What's the connection to Edgar Carrick? And this was the interesting part. Edgar Carrick describes the 7 good years as the years that he was able to be both a son to his father and a father to his son. In other words, his father passed away when his son was 7. He said it was a time at which I could look back and see my past, he said, and look forward and see my future. I didn't get that until the middle of reading the book, but that's basically what it means. How is his father being a Holocaust survivor connected to Edgar Carrick's storytelling? This is kind of interesting. When Edgar Carrick was a child, he would hear words like prostitute, mafia man, drunk person, And his father would tell him, for instance, gave the example of a drunk person as somebody who has a physical condition that the more liquids he drinks, the happier he becomes. And at about 11 or 12, Edgar Carrick found out that that's not really what a drunk person is. And he said, Dad, what's going on? Why did you tell me this definition? And his father said that, he said, when I wanted to tell you stories, my first instinct would be to tell you stories from my childhood, but what kind of stories would I tell you? And they were very horrific stories of growing up in Poland in the Nazi era. And then his father said, the reason I told you these euphemisms for words that are rather not nice is that the father always looked for reality, but that not mattering how ugly it is, he always tried to find humanity in what he was telling. And Edgar Carrick says that's what he's trying to do too in his writing. But what makes this an Israeli book, specifically Israeli book? I picked up on these things when I was reading because I've done them myself. First of all, this book was written not for an Israeli audience. He was trying to communicate the Israeli reality to the outside world. And it's not published in Israel and it's not published in Hebrew for that reason. Will it be translated? Don't know. The book starts with his wife in a hospital about to have a baby, and there's just been a terrorist attack and in Tel Aviv, or a suburb of Tel Aviv, and a journalist comes up to him wanting to get all kinds of details of the terrorist attack, and Edgar Carrick tells him, well, my wife is here in labor about to have a baby, and the journalist is disappointed because he wanted a juicy story about the terrorist attack. That is Edgar Carrick's form of satire. What else? He tells the story about when babies are born, and this is true. When parents have boy babies in Israel, every parent thinks that in another 18 years, when it's time for the kids to go to the army, there'll be peace and that child won't have to go to the army. And he says it. Another thing he talked about in one of his chapters was he was going somewhere by taxi in Tel Aviv, and the taxi driver started talking to him about wanting, this was during the Intifada, 2002 to 4. Taxi driver said, you know, it was easier to fight a real war with tanks than it is to have a guerrilla war where you can be traveling along on a bus and the bus is blown up. Because then you know who the enemy is, and you don't know when you get on a bus. He gives all sorts of examples like that, and he says that he himself, Edgar Carrick, feels between a rock and a hard place. In other words, he feels international readers this is a big generalization, but often blame him for Israeli actions because he's an Israeli writer, whereas Israelis claim that he is too leftist and against Israel. So he feels that he has it coming from both sides, and that's very hard for him. The last thing I want to say is about his writing. He says he's not going to write another nonfiction book anymore because he feels that it's easier to write fiction. He says that nonfiction is a historiography of his own life, which is harder, whereas fiction is an adventure. an adventure for him, and it's more fun as a writer. He and his wife look throughout the book for ways to couch the Israeli reality in a less harmful way, a fun way for their son. And he gives the example of there was an air raid siren going off. The book was written in summer 2014 during Protective Edge. And so he gives the example of there being an air raid siren, and they had to get out of the car and lie on the ground, and they didn't want to scare their son. So they told him they were all, the three of them were going to make a salami sandwich with the little kid in the middle and the parents around the sides. And the kid thought that it was fun. And so they achieved their goal. And what it reminded me of is the movie A Beautiful Life, which was about a little child with his father in a concentration camp, where the father was trying very hard to make the experience less traumatic for the child. So I enjoyed the book. It's written in a matter of 7 days, 7 years, one of the years being Kaddish for his father. I enjoyed the book, and I think you will too. It's an easy read. It's not long. It's an easy read, and it's enjoyable. That's it.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much, Margie.
Okay.
I'm so glad to learn about this book. And the other book was Fly Already, and we touched on that book by Edgar Carrick. We touched on the book also in the last session about humor and satire.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yes, I
Can you
should.
just tell us in a sentence or so what that book is about?
I didn't read that book. I only heard about it.
Okay.
But I want to say that Edgar Carrick and his wife and his father-in-law are well known as Israeli satirists. In other words, when Edgar Carrick writes, you always are asking yourself if he's speaking tongue in cheek or if he really means what he writes. And it keeps you on your toes.
Okay.
But that was the difference I was making between writing nonfiction and fiction.
Okay, thank you. Next, I'm going to call on Sandy Carlton, who has a few books to present to us.
And
Sandy,
she also had,
pardon?
did she also have, is this hers?
Yes.
Okay, great, good. So the book's on Israel with Gordis at the top.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I just need to,
Enlarge.
so Vivian, you are also a host, so you can unmute her because I'm not finding
Okay.
her.
Here we go. I thought you're unmuted. No, but let me find her. I have to search for her.
All right, you're unmuted.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So when I heard we were doing a book on Israel, these were two books that our federation, which is I'm from Rockford, Illinois, did 2 years ago when we wanted to spend the year, honoring Israel on their 70th anniversary. And so these were, books that we read. I'll be very brief. I hadn't really, planned to talk very long, but the first one is this book I really wanted to share was this book on Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn by Daniel Gordis. I know he's written other things on Israel. I believe it was, they said, winner of the Jewish Book Award in 2016. I'm not one who reads a lot of things on Israel. And so I read this book actually starting from the middle, which is something I never do. I never like to, once I start a book, I like to go and read it in the order. But our book discussion was going to be basically on the founding of Israel. And so we were told to start at page 254. And even then, I think it's a fairly long book, about 500 pages. I found this book so interesting, I think 254, I think started with basically Theodor Herzl in like 1898 and talks about the founding. As I finished it, I felt, I would really like to know more about the early history. And I found what I liked about this book is that he covers it, he moves fairly quickly, but I found it very readable. As someone who hasn't read a lot of historical nonfiction novels outside of American history, which I am interested in, he really covered it well. I also found that he tried not to be very political. He tried to keep, his own personal opinions. I know I read that, he's often critical of certain rabbis and things, but in this book, he made, I feel, an honest attempt to try to present the history, without coloring it a lot. And so, as I said, one book called it the first comprehensive yet accessible history of the state of Israel from its inception to present day, calling him one of the most respected Israeli analysts. I thought that's what pretty much described it for me. It was very comprehensive, yet easily accessible and understandable to read. Another one said, Gordis offers us a brief but thorough account of the cultural, economic, and political history of this complex nation from beginning to the present, and so on. He's actually an American author, born in New York in 1959, raised in Baltimore, basically educated in the United States, got his master's in rabbinical ordination at JTS, and his doctorate, it didn't say in what, at the University of Southern California. Went to Israel, I believe, around, I think around 1890 or 1998, and now, works at the Shalem College since 2017. But, I was raised in a Jewish family, but, I was born at the time of Israel, basically around the time that Israel became a state. I've heard a lot, but I didn't know a lot. It's just recently in later life that I've become more interested in the Jewish history so much. So anybody, I know there's a lot of people on the call who are very familiar with it. It's probably not one for you, but for somebody who hasn't delved into it a lot, I think it's a very understandable book. As I said, it's long. It's one I'd like to reread. But I felt after we read it, after I went back and read the beginning as well, I felt that if I ever had a chance to share a book about the history of Israel, that this would be one that I would strongly recommend. The second book was just kind of an afterthought. The Shimon Peres book, The No Room for Small Dreams, Courage, Imagination, and Making a Modern Israel. It was another one that we read during the 70th anniversary of Israel. Most people are very familiar with Peres. He just died a few years ago. This book was his last book. It was actually completed just a few weeks before he died. He emigrated went to Poland, or born in Poland, emigrated to Israel in 1934, has been, held, it seemed like to me, just about every position in the Israeli government at one time, got very involved with the leaders from the very beginning. As he said, he was 11 years old when he went to Israel. One of the things that I liked about the book, first, it is pretty much autobiographical, but I forget if it was a son or somebody else that helped him, as he, wasn't in the best of health as he was finishing this book. But what I speaks to me even more so now, because of everything that we're going through, is all the, the positive and negative things that he saw. He won elections, he lost elections, but kept on going. What's his positive attitude? This idea of, the courage, the imagination, and making of modern Israel is what stuck to me is that through everything that he's been through, you know, his love of country and his optimism for the future, you know, even in these modern times, was really what comes through. You know, I saw a film. We saw a film a few years ago in a sisterhood event, talking about Albert Weisser, who started, was very instrumental in starting the Israeli Air Force, and you know, all the things that he went through with all the other pilots to put their lives on the line. And you know, I think, you know, Perez gave up basically a family life. I think in later life his wife divorced him, you know, because of his kind of his promise to his grandfather before he left Poland, basically to carry on, you know, the Jewish cause and Jewish way of life. And I think, you know, he kind of did that to his death. So as he said, I enjoyed trying to understand the government system in Israel and going back and forth between the different parties, and how he continued to come to power. But also, I think, as he said, it was his imagination and positive attitude, no matter what he'd seen and what he'd been through, for the continuation of Israel, that got to me the most.
Okay, thank you so much. That was also two important books. Thank you. I forgot to call on, we may run a little over, if that's okay, on this discussion. And I haven't gotten to a couple of things, maybe 10 minutes. So I'd like to call on Merrill Harris, who's in Nashua, New Hampshire. And she also leads several book clubs and is quite a bibliophile. So Merrill, let's unmute you.
Oops, sorry. I'm just confirming also, do I have a slide for her to show?
No.
No, actually,
Good.
I'll let my books go this time. In the time.
You sure?
Yeah.
Do you have one that you want to share?
Uh,
Share a screen.
No,
if you want.
you know what? The books have been so interesting today. I think we have an overload of
Thank you.
books to read. So I'll let go today. And
Okay, so I'm going to then mention a few books, and then see if anyone else has a comment as we wrap up. So do we have my list here?
Is that
Okay.
slide up there?
No.
It
It
isn't
says
yet.
Vivian's. It's okay. There were two book covers. It's okay.
Oh, the book covers you want. Okay. All
Anna
right.
Krishan wrote
That's
a
what you
book
want. Okay.
called If All the Seas Were Ink.
Is it there
She
now?
won the Sammy Rohr Prize of the Jewish Book Council for this book. It was quite an original work. It's quite wonderful. The writing is exquisite.
Is it
It's
up
a
there?
memoir. She's a young woman, so she has a memoir. She is also an American. In fact, she was born in my region on Long Island, the daughter of Rabbi Neil Gershon, who's now retired, and she made Aliyah to Israel. And she describes a personal journey she took in this book in two fronts. She had a crisis in her life. Her first husband of only 1 year, they moved to Israel when they married, and then he left her after a year. So she had to rediscover who she was. That coincided with her friend casually mentioning the Daf Yomi project, which is a study worldwide of a page of the Talmud every day, which is a process that takes 7 years. And it's quite an in-depth study that goes on, and it's become better known since she wrote this book a few years ago. So we actually interviewed her for Women's League Reads, and she's quite wonderful. So you can find some of her interviews with us on the Women's League Reads page of the Women's League website or elsewhere. She is quite an intellectual. She the book ends in a beautiful, she goes through a lot of struggles, but very good things happen to her during this time that she is studying Daf Yomi. So it's quite a good book. Then I want to, I'm sorry, I lost my place. We have also the Alice Chalvey. She's an icon in Israel. If you don't have that book cover, I can hold. There she is. This book was published in Great Britain, I think. She actually was a founder of the Women's League Study Days in Israel, if I'm not mistaken. She wrote her memoir a few years ago, and she had quite a journey in her life too. The title refers to the fact that she was born in Germany. She's now about 95 years old, I think. So that's when she was a young girl, and in 1933, I believe it was, her family moved to England, and she spent all of her upbringing there until she was a young woman in her early 20s when she made Aliyah to Israel. She was a founder of and a big proponent of good education, Jewish and secular education for girls, Orthodox girls in Israel, because she started life as an Orthodox woman, and she gravitated more to the conservative Masorti movement and later on. She's a feminist, and she has a world renown. I saw her actually in New York City giving a book talk that was packed to the rafters a couple of years ago. So it's a worthy memoir. I want to find a couple of other books to point out. I don't have book covers to show, but Nicole Kraus wrote Forest Dark. It was quite a noteworthy book that got a big write-up in the Jewish press, like Forward and others. It's a combination of psychological study and as mysticism. As a woman has two main characters who start off in New York and both end up in Israel, where their stories merge a little bit at the Hilton in Tel Aviv, which is a key place in this novel. So I'm not going to go into detail because we're short on time, but she's quite a strong writer. It's a little bit of an unusual story. I can recommend it for her wonderful writing as well. She then,
is this the cover, Nicole Kraus,
Yeah.
Forest Dark? Okay.
Right. And finally, I want to make reference to Abigail Gretz's book, A Rabbi's Daughter. I don't have the cover for that, but she was just interviewed by Merkaz, and you could probably find that on the Merkaz USA website, about her book that is fictional but semi-autobiographical about her own upbringing as a rabbi's daughter in Israel, and her mother, Naomi Gretz, is also a professor and a writer in Israel. So with that, I want to thank everyone and ask first if we have a couple of minutes, anyone in the audience who would like to speak, you can signal by going to unmute yourself and speak out. That's one way. I'll let you do that. Did I forget anyone who was supposed to speak? Because then I apologize. If anyone wants to speak, click at the bottom of your screen is the button reactions on the right. Just, click on it and let us know you want to speak. Ellen Tillman, I believe, had her hand up. Ellen Tillman. Can we find her?
I'm looking in the list of alphabeticals. Just give me 1 minute.
Yes.
And she should be on mute. Not yet. Okay, don't touch your computer. I believe you're unmuted.
I am unmuted. Okay,
Excellent.
I really didn't raise my hand, but I put into the chat. If we're talking about books about Israel, you really can't skip Daniel Silver and the Gabriel Alone Israeli Secret Agent series. They're not great literature, but they are fun books that have lots of Israeli characters, current events, and they're just a fun reading set in Israel and all over the world.
And fiction.
And fiction, yep. And the new one's coming out in July.
Okay, that's Daniel Silver.
Silva, S-I-L-V.
Silva.
Okay.
And
Oh.
Yael Sharon. I have unmuted you.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out that Shimon Peres, he happened to be my neighbor for many years. We lived in the same building that his brother built in Ramat Aviv. You can't call, he's not Spanish. His name is not Perez, it's Peres. You got that?
Yes, and it's probably all of our different accents. So,
But it's his name, you know, you've got to say it as Peres and not Perez, because he's not from Mexico or whatever.
Okay.
It's,
Thank you.
It's short for Persky,
Oh, good point.
okay? They Hebraized, and he never divorced his wife. So that was,
Okay, thank you.
so,
So, Yael, you're in Israel as well, right?
absolutely.
Okay,
and Diane Friedgott, good to see you. She's raising her hand and I just unmuted her.
Where's Diane?
I wanted to acknowledge that we have a very large contingent here tonight from Israel, and that we have slowly gathered many of us together to be part of this Women's League, both Women's League Reads and this new project, Women Time for Books. And I thank all of you for joining in, and I hope that our sister in the States are also happy that we're part of the group tonight.
We are definitely happy.
Yeah, and in terms of Alice Chalvey, if you read the book, which it's a great book, Alice and I are still working together. The next Women's Study Day will be Zoom done by Zoom on June 19th, and Alice will be teaching. And in the middle of the book is a wonderful picture of the Women's Study Day, which is in the 21st year.
And
Thank
thank
you.
you
I'm
for
so glad you
organizing
did.
that every year. And we had a very large article about Alice Chalvey in our, I think it was our last New Outlook. I'm losing track of time. And Arlene is unmuted and has her hand up, and I think she's coming. Oh, you're in New York, your daughter's in New
Yeah, I'm in New York City. Just very briefly, I just purchased Emuna Elon's new book called House on Endless Waters. I don't know if anybody, but she's also Israeli author. She's written about life in the settlements, but I haven't read this one yet. Has anybody read anything? Rachel, did you know anything about this?
And what's the author's name?
Emuna Elon.
It's Arlene, we have good taste. It's on my nightstand. Yeah. I haven't gotten to it yet. It's in the pile, but that was translated. It's originally written in Hebrew, translated into English.
Yes, yes. I have a bunch of them, but that's the one that came to mind. I was thinking what I just bought in translation, but that was it.
Arlene, could you just write it in the chat so we have like
Sure. Okay,
Or the
sure.
author's name.
Okay.
Yes, Barbara asked that too, so.
Is anyone else's hand? Oh, I'm muted.
No, you're not. You're not muted. Vivian, we could hear you.
Okay. If there's no one else, I'd like to wrap this and thank everyone so much. This was just fascinating. I think one of our best. So I also want to see, is Margie Miller with us and wants to say any words?
I don't see
He
her
hasn't.
yet, but what I'm going to do, this might be dangerous. I'm going to unmute everyone. So that if
And I
there
can
was
see-
anyone who, this could be dangerous, but if there was anyone who wanted to say anything, I wouldn't want to silence anyone. And then also Margie can tell us if she's here. I think any of us were double booked today. And I can tell you it's really hard to jump from call to call because I tried that earlier. So I don't actually see Margie on.
Okay.
And so
Just say that Margie
Vivian,
Miller.
when are we joining again?
Okay, our next, I also, well, before I forget, I want to acknowledge Barbara Ezring has taken notes and is capturing all of the books we discussed, and it will be available. It may take a few days. If you want to send me an email, I will get it to you, private email, and that list. I also would want to let you know our next session of More Time for Books is going to be on Tuesday, May 12th. Same time, 3 p.m. Eastern time. And this has just come up that it is Lag BaOmer. So we're going to focus on books that have a setting in the natural world or a theme about the natural world, because we spend Lag BaOmer outside, appreciating nature. How among its many themes, that's one of them, appreciation of nature. So I can think off the top of my head of an author I've always loved, who is Barbara Kingsolver, not a Jewish
I've
author.
heard of her. No, I've heard of her though.
Appreciating nature. So
Vivian, I'm
after
going to
that,
stop you
there
for
are a
1 minute
number
just
of
so I
other-
can mute everybody, and then you'll unmute yourself. Okay? Okay. All right, you can go. Sorry.
Okay, so with that, I think we'll close. We have many categories of books we can discuss in the future. So May 12th, mark your calendars, and then May 28th, which is the day after the US Memorial Day. And the theme. So thank you to all our presenters today. And to everyone, please stay safe and well. And refuah shlemach to anyone who has fallen ill among our family and friends and acquaintances. And also kol kavod to all the healthcare workers and others who are helping us. So with that, thank you, Rabbi, and thank you, our presenters today, and have a wonderful day on Yom Ha'atzmaut.
Thank you, everybody, for all who presented, and it's wonderful to see everyone. This is was streamed on the Women's League Facebook page, so if you haven't liked us yet, you should like us. And you can join us again at 7 o'clock for a program this evening about Earth Day. So we're a week late, but we should celebrate the Earth. Good to see everyone. Vivian, absolutely incredible, and everybody else who participated. Toda rabah. And you say Chag Sameach, Diane?
Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Chag Sameach
Thank
to
you
all.
so much to all our Israeli participants. We're so pleased to have you, and please join us again.
Please do. Thank you all. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.